Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor to introduce to you today our keynote speaker, Dr. James I. Robertson, Jr. Known affectionately as Bud to his friends and colleagues, Dr. Robertson is the Alumni Distinguished Professor Emeritus in History at Virginia Tech. He is also Executive Director for Civil War Studies and is a charter member of Virginia's Civil War Sesquicentennial Commission. He served as Executive Director of the U.S. Centennial Commission to mark the conflict's 100th anniversary. He is the author or editor of more than 20 books that include award-winning studies of the Civil War. His biography of Stonewall Jackson won 8 national awards and was the basis for the movie Gods and Generals, for which he was also historical consultant. His talk today is on the uncontrollable war. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please join me in welcoming Dr. Robertson.
Thank you, Dennis. Mr. and Mrs. Campbell, I thank you both for inviting me to be part of this ceremony. I do not know another nation that would be doing this. Some 150 years ago, Americans began a war with Americans. Both were fighting for the same thing, their country. 4 years of combat left 750,000 men dead. 1 of every 4 boys who marched off to war did not come home. The average person would think that a tragedy of such horrendous proportions would best be forgotten. Yet this is not possible, because the greatest legacy of the Civil War is the United States we proudly call our country. One of the saddest ironies of the Civil War is that the state which had done the most in creating the Union suffered the greatest damage in the war fought to preserve that Union. Virginia had always been the leader of American nationalism. Its sons, Washington, Jefferson, Mason, Madison, Monroe, and Marshall, were in the front rank of the founding fathers. In 1803, when New England was so opposed to the Louisiana Purchase that its senators fought for secession, Virginia leadership talked them out of it. A decade later, in the War of 1812, New England again made waves to leave the Union. Again, Virginia led the way in squashing such thoughts. In 1850, a group of Southerners gathered in Nashville with secession a major item on the agenda. Virginia's refusal to participate doomed that convention. The Old Dominion would have nothing to do with the first exodus of the states from the Union in 1860 and 61. As the crisis worsened, Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas exclaimed, "Save Virginia and we will save the Union." However, Lincoln's call for troops following the bombardment at Fort Sumter was an action that Virginia leaders would not accept as constitutionally valid. Reluctantly did the state leave a union she had worked so arduously to create. The secession of Virginia turned what might have been a little more than a sectional disturbance easily into a major war. Noted historian Bruce Catton once observed, the new Southern nation was struggling to be born in 1861, and it needed Virginia as a man needs the breath of life. Without Virginia, the Confederacy had no hope of winning the war. Unfortunately, that political action would make the Old Dominion the principal battlefield of the war. Some 60% of all engagements occurred inside the state. And it had to be that way. Virginia, literally as well as figuratively, was the center of the struggle. The state lay squarely between North and South. It was the second largest state, with some of its counties extending to the Ohio River. The very shape of Virginia was like a spear thrusting itself into the heart of the North. On the other hand, it was the most exposed of Confederate states, being vulnerable to attack from 3 different directions. The Commonwealth was the wealthiest of the Confederate states, with an industrial capacity greater than that of the 7 original states forming the Confederacy. Fully 20% of the South's all-important railroads lay within Virginia. The state's iron production was 3 times greater than second-place Tennessee. Its lead mines were invaluable for ammunition. Its salt works were essential for food preservation, its coal mines were the single factor that kept the Confederate Navy afloat. Norfolk was the largest Navy yard south of the Potomac River. Richmond was the closest thing to a manufacturing center as existed in the South. Union authorities knew that by seizing Richmond they would rip the heart from the Confederacy. Southerners also were aware that Richmond was the one city in their fledgling country that had to be protected to the end. That is why one of the war's first battles of note was fought here on grounds in Williamsburg. Had the outcome been different here, the war might have lived up to earlier short-sighted expectations. Both sides went into the struggle convinced that the other side was really not very much in earnest and would give up after a battle or two. Leaders north and south confidently believed in 1861 that they had the Civil War well under control. As a matter of fact, the war first shocked and then overwhelmed both sides. Too soon, men discovered themselves in a conflict so widespread, so all-consuming, that they floundered amid fluctuating uncertainty and unceasing bloodshed for 4 awful years. It was a killing time that shook America to the deepest depth of its being. And the explanation for such totality is simple. Before 1861, wars had been limited in scope because they were limited in objective. Merely seizing an opponent's capital usually brought a contest to a quick end. But it could not be that way in the American War. It was a struggle without boundaries. Each side was fighting for an absolute. The North for preservation of the government, the South for independence. A nation that would stand passively by and watch itself disintegrate, Mr. Lincoln declared, was unworthy of the name nation. We joined the Union voluntarily, Southern statesmen exclaimed, and just as voluntarily do we have the right to leave that association. In other words, no middle ground existed in 1861. With the two war objectives at extremes, there was no room for compromise, the only ingredient that holds a democracy together. And we would do well in this day and age to remember that simple axiom. Compromise brought us together. Compromise is the only thing that will hold us together. I wish those people in Washington would read a little history.
On those sides.
A statement to make, and people used to laugh at it, now they applaud. I honestly feel that any person elected to the United States Congress ought to have to take an American history qualification test.
Hear, hear.
If he fails it, they are disqualified. They can't run in.
I think that will get rid of most.
Get rid of a lot of them.
But in this such an environment,
And have to have refresher courses every few years too.
And the other side had to be conquered. Now, the early Union commanders did not see this. Pitiful George McClellan pursued century-old strategy by attempting to seize Richmond and end the war quickly. McClellan's counterparts in the West, Halleck, Rosecrans, Buell, followed the same inappropriate tactics. In 1863, the North began to have a new brand of commanders. Ulysses S. Grant literally fought his way to the top of the list by pounding the South unceasingly. Put in its simplest form, McClellan sought to play chess and failed. Grant played checkers and won the war. When the guns stopped firing in the spring of 1865, Virginia was a wasteland. From Arlington to Abington was the same sight. Home and businesses destroyed, fields ruined, livestock slaughtered, streams polluted, bridges wrecked, railroads dismantled, roads impassable, families crippled and bankrupt. Every urban area in the Old Dominion lay in shambles. In one night, out-of-control fires burned 800 buildings in downtown Richmond. At least 360,000 emancipated slaves in Virginia looked for some place to go. and something to do when they got there. Virginia's principal commodity, land, had averaged $150 an acre at war's outset. Now that same land in 1865 went unsold at $2 an acre. A New York soldier heading home likened the Old Dominion to, quote, little less than one vast graveyard. Worst of all, 30,000 of Virginia's sons were gone, many lying in unmarked graves stretching from Chattanooga to Gettysburg. We can never measure the impact of their deaths. It is not just those soldiers who vanished. We lost the dreams they might have brought to reality. We lost the statesmanship they might have given, the scientific discoveries they might have made, the great works of art and literature and music they might have created. And we lost the children they never had, all the contributions that generation might have imparted to mankind, and all of the things that their offspring might have done years later. To say that nearly 30,000 died is only a figure. One cannot measure the full loss to this country of those men who wore the blue and the gray. And what are the other 700,000 Americans whose lives were so short? Well, we stand here today. We stand to remember where once our ancestors stood and fought. Despite what stands upon the land now, these grounds have been consecrated by the blood of patriots. There are those who want to forget history. They belong to a citizenry that is doomed, because only from the past can we gain a genuine insight as to where we are and where we are going. History is the greatest teacher any of us can ever have. From the Civil War came unity as well as freedom for all Americans. Those gifts are too indelible and too precious to overlook. So on this 150th anniversary of a certainly underrated battle of the war, we can meet to commemorate what was done here as part of a great civil war that remains the watershed of our national history. We recall with reverence the young men who bravely marched down the untraveled road to tomorrow and never came back. What they gave, we now share. What they lost, we gain. Their sacrifices are a collective blessing of us all. And that blessing is called America. And if we ever forget that, God help us all. Thank you very much.
Amen.